Good evening, one and all. This is Rudranaran Das. Welcome everyone present here in Facebook Live and YouTube. Uh, it's a great privilege to me for welcoming all of you to World Human Sciences and Management Conference 2022 Invitations to Global Dialogue on Agnotological Context, Disciplinary Practices of Social Sciences and Policy Frames, an initiative towards think time and rethink episteme. Distinguished participants, partakers, it's a glorious moment to extend my warm wishes on behalf of Center for ADIVASI Research and Development. As you know, the conference is built on intake of active and interactive learning and discussion organized by Center for Adivasi Research and Development in collaboration with Indian Institute of Management, Sambalpur, Central University of Odisha, and Ravenshaw University, Cuttack. One second. So on behalf of Center for Adivasi Research and Development, I want to convey my heartfelt gratitude to our patrons, Professor Sanjay Kumar Naik, Vice Chancellor, Ravenshaw University, Professor Mahadev Jaiswal, Director, Indian Institute of Management, and Professor Sarath Kumar Palita, Vice Chancellor, Central University of Odisha. The convener of this largest virtual conference are eminent Indian historian Professor Chandi Prasad Nanda and eminent policy activist, writer and philanthropist Mr. Charudatta Panigrahi. As you know that the main outcome of this conference is to come up with the national and international framework for the education system in future. And the crux of this conference will be the use of digital technologies such as artificial intelligence, augmented reality, and virtual reality that is being increasingly adopted after the outbreak of COVID pandemic. We hope this conference would help students, faculties, researchers, and all to expand their mental horizon and help the education system to adopt the best in future. Ladies and gentlemen, Center for Adivasi Research and Development is a leading research-oriented institution promoting ethnographic, empirical, and evidence-based research for engaging and addressing the challenges that 21st century globe is facing today. And our prime agenda is to come up with potential policy solutions for social change while believing the idea of debate, dialogue, and discussion. So in this sense, it gives me a tremendous contentment to introduce the most esteemed young and dynamic personality of today's symposia is none other than Mr. Shaan Kashyap. So Shaan Kashyap is currently pursuing a Ph.D. in history at Ravenshaw University, Cuttack, Odisha. He intends to write a history of vanishing villages in the Anthropocene. Previously, he studied modern history at Jawaharlal Nehru University, Delhi, and submitted an M.Phil dissertation on history textbook controversies. So, welcome, Mr. Shaan. Shaan is also a very good friend of mine. And the topic is, as suggested by Mr. Shaan, is making of the first history textbook controversy in independent India, which will definitely be an eye-opening session for all of us. Our larger audiences are in Facebook, and there are some, especially some CBSE 10th students are with us to listen, Mr. Shaan, particularly. So it was a it is a very important talk for all of us. So with this note, I'd like to stop here and invite Shaan to initiate his talk. Over to you, Shaan.
Thank you so much. I hope I'm audible well and
yes.
thank you. Good evening, everyone. I should start by extending my thanks first to Center for Adivasi Research and Development and its director, Dr. Bikram Kishori Jena, and the whole team, who, by the way, I'm also a part of it. So it's like, talking to one's own home people and expecting some critical marks, some questions, some criticisms in the uh, as we progress through it. So I'll take somewhat 40 to 45 minutes to present what I have to say, and then we can straight go into conversations, disagreements, criticisms, or add-ons from the audiences as it comes through. Now, before I proceed, let's have like two, three things as disclaimer. The number one is that textbook controversy, and more particularly history textbook controversy, is not unique to India. It has a global history. So you can think of, starting right away from the neighborhood, examples like China and Pakistan, they have continuously suffered history textbook controversies. Japan, Korea, Germany, United States, Brazil, so you can hardly think of examples which have not really encountered history textbook controversies, and what these controversies are all about. So let me give you a very recent example. So we all know about the unfortunate assassination of Shinzo Abe just the last week. He was the longest serving Japanese prime minister, and Abe, in his 13, 14 years of premiership, championed something called historical negationism. Historical negationism, also called denialism, is falsification or distortion of historical records. So, very accepted consensus based historical facts are distorted to say something else, something which we keep encountering in India these days. Someone claiming that Taj Mahal is not really Taj Mahal, it is Shivala, it is Tejo Mahalya. So, these kind of examples, or, globally, there are a range of people who have denied that Jewish Holocaust really happened in World War II. So, there are Holocaust deniers. So Abe championed historical negationism, and this was basically contained to, reinterpreting or denying Japanese war crimes during World War II. So at least we can think of two of the greatest crimes committed by Japanese soldiers during World War II. The first is something called Nanjing Massacre. So when Japan attacked China in 1936-37, the capital of then Republic of China, which was Nanjing, uh, it led to the estimates vary from 40,000 to 200,000, 2 lakh people being killed, and 20,000 to 40,000 rapes being committed. So this is something which is a very great blot in the history of Japanese military regime. But Abe championed the cause, continuously stating that this was not done, so denying a piece of history. The other example could be Korean comfort women. So when Japan, annexed and attacked Korea, a large segment, a group of Korean women were, usually abused and harassed into being comfort women for giving them sexual pleasure and all that. So these are the things which are well settled, which are historically recorded. Different historians and scholars have views about them, but you go and deny it. So Abe championed this cause. He believed that history should be rewritten, these things should be washed away from the Japanese textbooks, and he championed something called Society for History Textbook Reforms. So we have to be careful that this word reform is not always a very welcoming word. Reforms can sometimes lead to very dramatic, devastating, and dangerous results, as we see with Shinzo Abe and Japanese textbook controversy. So that's the first disclaimer, that textbook controversy is not unique to India. It has a global history. You can think of Pakistan, China. China, for instance, has been revising their textbooks for a number of times, as most recently in July 1st, 2021, which, to refresh your political history, was the centenary celebration of the establishment of Communist Party of China. Now they have a small brief title. It's called A Brief History of Communist Party of China, which by the way is published by party's Central Committee Party Affairs. And a mandatory read across universities and colleges. But with every landmark, and depending on who is at the helm, right now it's being Xi Jinping, China goes on revising, different important historical episodes. So how much of Mao's cultural revolution should be written about? How much, let's say, Great Leap Forward should be written about? Because we know that these campaigns were actually, it took a great toll on the Chinese population. So many people got killed. We encountered massive famines. And these episodes, which are well known, well documented, would be keep on, they go on changing in the number of either in the scope, in the number of pages they are talked about. So this revision is something which is very global. So today, when the government in Delhi is very keen on changing certain aspects of textbook or rewriting certain aspects of history, it should not come to us as a surprise. This is a very uh, you know ongoing practice of regulation that governments in power, left, right, center, have changed textbooks for all their political and ideological causes in the past, and it happens globally. Number two, second disclaimer would be something related to what Dipesh Chakrabarti has called the public life of history. That why we are really interested in this problem. We are interested in this problem because history with capital H, an academic discipline that we teach, we study, we research, and we write, also has a public life in this country and elsewhere. So you can think of, let's say, 100 years of public life of history in this country when first BA programs of history started coming in 1910s and 1920s in University of Calcutta and elsewhere. By 1930s, we saw that professionalization of history started taking place with the establishment of Indian History Congress in 1935-36. By 1940s, we saw that professionalization of history started taking place with the establishment of Indian History Congress in 1945. By 1950s, we saw that professionalization of history started taking place with the establishment of so if there is a controversy, and since this is ongoing, let's say that whether you rely on the history of architectures by calling Taj Mahal, or you really want to go with Purushottam Nagesh Oak, calling it Tejo Mahal, yeah, because he has also given his reasons and evidences. So a historian, a Mughal historian, should not rely on the architecture of Taj Mahal. He should rely on the architecture of But what happens when people and public stop listening to experts, right? So Chakrabarti dwells in this problem asking, and this is a quote, I'm going to quote him: the fact respecting secular historian in India can bring his or her reasoning to the public, but there is no guarantee that the public will bring their attention. Given their expertise, it is only understandable that historians in India should seek a role in adjudicating disputes about the past, right? But the query goes further when he asks that what really stops them. So you can think of, let's say, was written by some 25 historians, and they provided all the evidence claiming that any historical evidence really doesn't testify of a temple in Ayodhya, right? But a large segment of the public on the other side believed that the temple existed, it was demolished, and the masjid, the mosque, came in its place, right? Now, that's in 1990. We have come a long way. We now that the temple is already in construction, it should be completed by next year. But when you think of this public controversy, you realize that historians, with all their historical evidence, facts, and truths and interpretation of the past, came along with one consensus that the temple was not there. But the people or the public, or at least a segment of the public, did not listen to them. So, how do you really explain the making has been picked up from E.P. Thompson's famous work, The Making of the Working Class? The reason is to emphasize the continuity. That textbook controversy is something which doesn't really appear in the contemporary India after 1947. I have written histories which testify that we can think of textbook controversies at least from 1860s onwards. It's a business which even the colonial state had to deal with, and they dealt with it quite well. In fact, much better than what our governments are doing now. So that's a talk for a different day. Now, why I called it first? First acceptable across the literature, from Vinay Lal to Bipan Chandra group to the JNU historians to Aligarh historians to historians at Calcutta. This is something which has been an acceptable fact through and through, right? That the first history textbook controversy erupted in 1977 with Janata Party government coming in power after emergency, and Janata Party government took away certain passages and blackened certain paragraphs which were deemed controversial. Of course, cow and beef debate also came along. This is a debate which is with us for the past 200 years. It doesn't really appear today. That NCRT textbooks authored by Romilath Harper, Bipan Chandra, and R.S. Sharma, and two other books. The one co-authored by Amlesh Tripathi, Bipan Chandra, and Varun Dey. It is called Freedom Struggle, a very simple, slim volume. Is still in publication, published by National Book Trust, and a more slimmer booklet, which was published by People's Publishing House (PPH) in 1967, on communalization of history, written by three historians: Romila Thapar dealing with ancient India, Harbans Mukhya dealing with medieval India, and Bipan Chandra dealing with modern India, were banned, right? Were banned. And then we see a series of very radical responses from historians like consensus. What I'm going to show you is that this consensus is wrong. That history textbook controversy has happened much before, at least 2 decades before the Janata Party government controversy, and it has not been reported in literature so far. So this comes out from my M.Phil work dissertation, and one fine day I come across this 50 pages of record in National Archives of India, which has not been consulted so far anywhere in the literature. So this is something which I'm working on, and I'm sharing with you for the first time. That first history textbook controversy in independent India happened in Kerala in 1958. Now, there is an angle to it. To rehash your political history and your memory, in 1958, something very dramatic happens in Kerala in the history of democratic India, which was Communist Party of India comes to power, and EMS Namboodiripad becomes the chief minister. This is an event of dramatic importance because for the first time anywhere in the world, communists come into power through a democratically elected government. That's the first democratically elected government in Kerala under EMS Namboodiripad. The government is suspended after 1 year by the Premier Jawaharlal Nehru, and President rule is imposed. That's a different story. So now what we are going to focus in the remaining time we have is this 1 year gap of 58 to 59 and what happened in Kerala. And I again re-emphasize, underline that this was never reported in the literature so far. So whenever we used to talk about the history textbook controversy in India, we used to start with 1977 Janata Party government. Now with this research, we should start with 1958 Kerala. Now, communism in Kerala had a long history, and still they are in power in Kerala with Pinarayi Vijayan and form this the Communist Party faction, the unit in Kerala. Now, in 1957, the CPI was elected to rule the state government of Kerala, the first democratically elected communist government anywhere in the world. However, the Nehru government in Delhi dismissed it, and president rule was declared in 1959 following Vimochana Samaram. Now, Vimochana Samaram is a Malayalam word, and it was a political campaign which roughly translates into English as liberation struggle. So in 57, 58, when communists come to power, they overspear this very well designed political campaign in the state of Kerala called Vimochana Samaram, which allowed for a backlash on Kerala state textbooks as well. So, different facets of the government and the governance were influenced by this dramatic, radical political campaign. And the textbooks also had to undergo certain changes. Now, it was alleged by the Ministry of Education, Government of India, that textbooks were indulged in communist propaganda. And even an inquiry committee was formed to look into the matter. So, now what we are going to do is we are going to unearth and then unthread these developments in a very quick succession. Now, Khwaja Ghulam Saidian, who was a Aligarh-based author and writer and an educationist, was the secretary of Ministry of Education then, and he received a memo, a press memo, by two newspapers, Organizer and Hindustan Standard, in August 1958, complaining that the communist propaganda in the Kerala textbooks have risen so much that they have found in the nationalization of textbooks a fertile ground for indoctrination. Now, communist indoctrination in textbooks is something which has been very well documented across the globe. At least we can think about it in the earlier Soviet Russian examples, in the Poland examples, China I talked about in a little detail to you. Now, the report further stated that now the evidence starts coming in. So that these newspaper reports are stated that Social Studies third series, which is a book prescribed for class 8, there are essays on Russian and Chinese revolution with, quote, large size portraits of Karl Marx, Lenin, and Mao Zedong. The Russian Revolution, the report suggests, described Russian Revolution as, quote, what a great revolution that was. On China, titled Communist Victory, which in Malayalam will be Communist Vijayana. according to press reports, expressed the view of EMS Namboodiripad, the chief minister then, suggesting that, quote, China will be repeated in Kerala if the parties in opposition form a common anti-communist front. China will be repeated in Kerala if the parties in opposition form a common anti-communist front. What does that mean? The indirect reference, it seems, is it to anti-rightist movements in Kerala, which are essentially we can go ahead of a China-like purge of the rightists. Again, here, for Communist Party purposes. The news report in Hindustan Standard even carried an extract from a booklet in Malayalam called Communist Vijayan, Communist Victory, which was prescribed for class 7th. Elucidating on the Russian Revolution, the extract reads, quote, the properties in possession of the landlords were confiscated and distributed among peasants. Swiftly whether America recognizes it or not. In China now, there is neither begging nor unemployment. Now, we know that this is actually talking about a period when China had already gone the Great Leap Forward campaign, and more than, 20 million Chinese died in man-made famines. And here we have a textbook which claims that in China now there is no begging nor unemployment. Now, with these two news reports, another, other local Malayali and Kerala-based newspapers comes along. So we know of the famous Malayalam Manorama, which is still in publication and circulation. It also added a report suggesting that in Kerala, the emphasis was laid upon Russian and Chinese revolution, and at the same time, underrating the nation building efforts in India. The paper also made a pitch for a scrutiny of each lesson and appealed to the people to bring the episode to the notice of the central government in Delhi. Now, central government in Delhi, which would seem implausible from today's standards, because today always comparing the current prime minister with Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru, we find Nehru more democratic and all that. The setup is that when it comes to the nationalism and nation making, almost every government from every political persuasion acts similar, very alike. So the Ministry of Education takes cognizance and within 3 months start an inquiry into the matter. Now, the KJ Sadian forwards the report to the Secretary Director R.K. Kapoor in August 1958. And Kapoor makes a very important note in his findings, and this is a part of that archival document, which shows that Director Central Bureau of Textbook Research, mind you, this is 58, 59. The NCRT is still not there. NCRT came into existence in 1961. So this agency, Central Bureau of Textbook Research, is the precursor, is the predecessor agency of NCERT, right? So he notes that Director CBTR visited Kerala recently. She too, in her report, brought out the point which has since been taken up by some newspapers. So the noting of Kapoor is important in this regard because it suggests that it was the remarks and observation of Director CBTR which triggered the newspaper reports rather than the opposite. So the Director CBTR had actually taken notice of the communist indoctrination in the textbook, and she had reported it to the Ministry of Education before the newspapers jumped in, right? Now, this director, Rukmini Krishna Swamy, agreed that Kerala textbooks have to be examined on the following basis. Number one, the extent to which actual facts of history has been distorted in this book. So the problem of distortion, the problem of what really goes into the textbooks comes into, existence. So what they're really trying to do is they're saying that we don't want historical negationism, something what like Shinzo Abe was doing in Japan, right? You need to have the facts straight. The extent to which certain parties in the world have been necessarily vilified. So of course, you have glorified Chinese Revolution and Russian Revolution, but the parties and the governments which you think are not left, are not communist, they have been vilified, right? And third, the extent to which any one ideology, communism in this case, is given as the very best in exclusion to all others, right? Now, it comes with, again, different kind of problems such as what really happens, logistics, the issue of logistics, because the ministry had to arrange language experts. These books are in Malayali, they were written in Malayalam, and the ministry has to find language experts before more than 85 of these textbooks are written and understood that what they really contain. And this goes on, and the controversy becomes big because finally on November 1st, 1958, now in August end this picks up, and in November 1st, 1958, Prem Kripal, who was secretary of the ministry, gives a go ahead for the scrutiny, which may be confined to textbooks in social studies, including history. Now, within 3 months, the ministry forms a committee of inquiry into this whole matter. So you can just imagine the gravity, the seriousness of the issue, because we know that how things paced up in our system, and how governments take a lot of time in responding to issues. Not in this case. Now, the other factor would be that right now we are just talking about the government memos, the secretary's correspondences, the government inquiries. But a textbook controversy really becomes a controversy when public becomes involved. So if it is only about some memo circulating in some, government offices, it really doesn't make a lot of sense for the people at large. When people become involved, it really takes up the issue. So what happens? People become involved. The Kerala Schools Manager Association, Kottayam, presents a memorial directly to the President of India. Their main concern is that the textbook production by then was either limited to individuals or private organizations. Thereby, they argue that we had a lot of different textbooks of different ideological persuasions. The state and government so far by late 1950s was not interested in producing one kind of textbooks, uniform textbooks for everyone. So they are arguing that the earlier arrangement where different individuals and different organizations were writing different set of textbooks, we have a heterogeneity about opinions. There was no homogeneity of opinions. With the state and the government jumping right into the production and circulation and authorship of textbooks, now we have a homogeneity of opinion. Because, as they say, that the government's role was limited by to approving the text. Government's role was only limited to approving of the text, that which text would be subscribed in the board's curriculum, right? However, the CPI government in Kerala scrapped the system in place and made the publication and distribution of textbook to be done only by the government. Moreover, the contentious issue, the government nominated the ruling party members and its affiliates to author the textbooks. Now, this is a concern which stays with us. That today we will keep hearing that the present regime is now, going ahead by nominating its affiliates and its sympathizers to write textbooks. So we think about RSS sympathizers or RSS cadre playing a very influential role in writing and distorting history as we know them, right? But this is something which has a long history in the tradition, which starts with this controversy that how government plays a very keen role in nominating only those people to write only a certain kind of historical narrative, which they will find is close to their ideology and political program, right? Now, they also add a very important appendix with their letter to the president. Now, these are the two very interesting examples. Social studies series, book 2 for standard 6, class 6. Okay. In dealing with history and teachings of some world famous persons, it was reported that the name of Mahatma Gandhi, the father of the Indian nation, does not find a place. So this is again something which has stayed with us, that even today we will keep arguing that certain state government or certain people from certain states will keep complaining that we don't have this figure in history textbooks. So let's say people from, since I'm speaking from here at the state, the people from Odisha will, let's say, make a very legitimate complaint that the icons of Utkal movement are not fairly represented in national textbooks produced by NCERT. So you might not find a reference of Aradhanath Ray, Madhusudan Das, and others, right? But this is going on. So like the school manager association makes it a point that in this book, which is dedicated to famous people from the world, historical people, Mahatma Gandhi, the father of the nation, do not find any place. Rather, while the same book, a short biography of Karl Marx was provided in 2 pages, suggesting the Russian Revolution is the first triumph of social equality theory of Marx. Another very interesting take. In book 3 for class 7, contained a reference on Stalin and Trotsky conflict. So to rehash your political history, we know that after Russian Revolution and after the death of Vladimir Lenin, there was a power struggle between the Stalin faction and the Trotsky faction. And ultimately, Trotsky lost and he had to run away from the country, live in exile in Mexico, and was later assassinated by KGB. Right? Now, while the association was perturbed that this reference was summed up in just one sentence, the only description was rivalry arose between Trotsky and Stalin. Stalin triumphed. One could ask why the students of class 7th were being even taught about such a grievous outcome of Russian Revolution in such phrasal emphatic of brevity. So why do you really want to teach class 7 students such a controversial and nuanced take on history in such a simplified, simplistic fashion? Why class 7 students really need to know that what happened between Stalin and Trotsky and how Stalin triumphed? Now, these all goes back to what the party was trying to do. Few parents association also got informed from Kathiragapalli and Kottayam, and they wrote, letters straight to the Ministry of Education, Government of India, that the what the textbooks are doing is they only seem to place before the children the communist ideals and appreciation and acceptance. Now, you would think, but a very interesting stakeholder which got involved in this controversy was Catholic Congress Local Committee, a curious party for the textbook controversy. Through their president S.C. Joseph, they again wrote a letter straight to the president of India. Why do Catholic Congress has to get involved in history textbook controversy? So for any of us who know anything about history textbooks and their history in this country know that by 1860s and 1870s, missionaries and predominantly Catholics and uh, especially Jews produced a large number of history textbooks. For example, for Odisha students, for more than 30 years, they read the textbook written by W.S. Sutton, who was a Catholic missionary, and his textbook remained very primarily famous and the only example of a history textbook which was prescribed by government matriculation board. Now, these Catholic committees were also producing textbooks. And when the government and the state took over, of course, their textbooks have to be wiped out and banned from the system. They were perturbed that the communist government in Kerala has monopolized the right and privileges of the publication of textbooks, and those textbooks have degraded the religious, moral, cultural, and social aspects of life. Of course, because the communist textbooks, in some of their political stance, were also propagating atheism, attack on religion, and any religious group, be it Catholic, be it Hindu, be it Islam, would not want it. Now, the Catholics, since already they had a very well designed, well oiled, well engineered system of textbook production, and since they were, you know, uh, pushed out of the business by the state monopoly, they had certain very genuine complaints. Now, in the end, I'll quickly sum up in 10 more minutes and then we can take some questions and all that. In the end, much didn't happen in Kerala state textbook controversy. Why? When I discovered these records and I realized that this was something a much bigger of a news and an event, except some government memos going from one table to the other table in a ministry, because school association was involved, parents associations was involved, the local press was writing about it, religious associations were involved, and then the government in Delhi must have felt a lot of pressure, and that's why they constituted an inquiry committee in just a matter of 3 months. So the seriousness of issue is very important, and it has to be inserted in this history so that we get a historical significance correct. What is historical significance? Historical significance is a concept where we primarily reason that something is significant on this particular day. So, what I'm trying to propose is I'm trying to say that let's revise this textbook controversy date from 1977 to 1958. Now, why this was missing in the literature? A logistic reason would be that no one found that record in National Archive of India. They never knew about it. So someone found it and someone has written about it. But it became a non-issue primarily because of two reasons. First, Ministry of Education was not sure and certain that how to deal with the case, since education was a state subject. It still is. But today we live in different times. We can see central governments drafting national education policies and then ensuring that everyone implements it. But even today we know that the states like Tamil Nadu and West Bengal are very much reluctant because of their political persuasions to implement national education policy 2020 in their states, right? The confusion over the course of action loomed large from the very beginning. Ved Prakash, who was then Assistant Educational Advisor, Ministry of Education, in an office memorandum dated January 29, 1959, noted, and I quote, as education is a state subject and writing the textbooks is entirely the concern of state government, it is not clear what course of action the Ministry of Education then take in this regard. Ministry of Education requested Ministry of Law in this regard to suggest the possible course of actions. Meanwhile, others were demanding different recourse. For instance, Kerala School Manager Association was unhappy about the Kerala state government's proposal of putting the books for scrutiny of S. Radhakrishnan, the Vice President of India. On contrary, they suggested in their memorial to the President of India that a committee of parliament members should be appointed to examine and inquire into the issue. So that's one reason, the reason of constitutionality. That what do you do about an issue which belongs to a subject which is a state subject? What do you do about it? They were not sure, right? The second and the more important reason is purely political. Vimochan Samara triggered widely across the state in the subsequent months, and union government dismissed the CPI government in Kerala on July 31st, 1959, imposing the president rule in the state under Article 356 of the Constitution of India. Now, when the assembly elections were organized again, Pattom Thanno Pillai, who was from the Praja Socialist Party, became the CM, followed by Raman Shankara of Indian National Congress. So CPI went out of the power because the government was dismissed. And as it happened, and the government was replaced by another party, the issue became a non issue. Because as the government was gone, the textbook which they has published also went out from the circulation and from the publication and distribution. So it became a non issue. But why this issue is really important? It teaches us these two very important lessons, which has stayed with us even today. The number one is the government's and political parties' tendency to keep, reconfiguring and revising and reinterpreting historical narratives to suit their political agenda, which stands through and through. It happened in 1977 with Janata Party government. It again happened in 2002 with the first NDA government under Atal Bihari Vajpayee, when again the same set of textbooks, which was still in circulation by R.S. Sharma, Romilla, Bipin Chandra, Satish Chandra, Arjun Dev, were again taken out of print and taken out of curriculum, and new set of textbooks were welcomed in. The second issue is that textbook controversies go on accumulating because we still haven't addressed these two, three very core issues which remain very important for Indian history. So you can think of issues like Aryan migration theory. You can think of issues like what happened to temples and issues of religious conversion in medieval India. And the issue of whether you think of the national movement only in the terms of Congress politics, or whether we also want to get in other contenders, which were Hindu nationalists, which were communists, which were socialists, which were persuasions of revolutionary terrorism, as Bhagat Singh and others have been called by Bipin Chandra and others. And then what kind of textbooks we want to use to people, the students who read these histories, are really trained and taught to how to think historically. The other issue is that the people who really drafted these textbooks, and this can be a talk for some other time, they thought that they can make the historical thinking and historical consciousness by producing secular histories. That's exactly what they did. They produced secular histories to make secular citizens. They did not realize that citizens and public at large may not depend solely on textbooks and school textbooks for their historical consciousness. That historical consciousness comes from different kinds of activities. So we never taught about a Purushottam Nagesh Oak and his mad theories about Taj Mahal and Red Fort. But Purushottam Nagesh Oak and his lunacy has survived with us. And today we are again back to the same circle, first square, and we are still arguing the same set of issues. In this country, at least till 1960s, we have textbook evidences where in the same paragraph, Akbar was also great and Maharana Pratap was also great. No one contested that who is greater among the two, between the two. But today, we have reached a point where we are
Thank you so much, Shaan, for your wonderful deliberation on your state topic. Now, I would like to invite If any audience have some questions to Mr. Shaan, Dr. Jena is here. Dr. Jena, please.
Thank you so much, Rudra. Thank you so much, Mr. San, for a very fantastic and very informative kind of deliberation about history, textbook and controversy of history. It's very difficult to say when we are talking about this particular controversy of a discipline like history, because history leads always social science. As you know, the paradoxical framework written by many the doctrine of officials of in colonial period. And you rightly pointed out about the left standardization of history book, history textbook writings. Besides all these, I would like to know, as your information or as your work, which data and source deal by you. When many professors of history always preferring to go to archive, I don't believe in archival documents, because archival documents always, instead of standardized and monopolized setting by these officers, those officers are working under the regime. You rightly picked out the NDA one and also the Janata Dal. Besides all, when the country got independent in 1947, and then this particular Nehru-Bihan modernization and Nehru-Bihan development model always criticized and challenged by many white writers and many black writers also. Then, when 1952, our country faced the first electoral democratical progress or practice. What happened then? What always Bipin Chandra saying in many his talks and many his lectures, history is all about maximum numbers of possibilities. And if you read very clearly about Bipin Chandra, he always stated that history is not anybody's umbrella, or history is not anybody's uh, cake who want to eat it. It deals with the source of the nation, and it's represent a country, it's represent a state, it represent a whole. You rightly picked out of Dipesh Chakraborty, the public life of 100 years. When we're going to deal with these kind of sources, we don't have monopolize, or we don't have any kind of oh, chat, quote unquote, the Hindi version. History is always very perfect and very perfectionist for any country, for any nation. Without history, the country is not well being, not well knowing, not well understandable through the pockets of these particular history writers. What is your assumptions and what is your suggestions for these young historians? Those are likely to be as a career in history. What is your suggestions? How to write history in a perfect, and how to write history in a very specific and very gentle kind of writers is concerned, please.
Uh, Hello. Yeah. So there are a variety of issues in your concern. Thank you so much for your insightful comments, as always. The first issue would be that of archives. Now, since we know the conception of archives has changed very dramatically, especially after people like Michel Foucault, we don't today think of archive only as this one Sarkari building, which has records from Home Department, Revenue Department, and other set of departments. The whole purpose of the colonial archive was they were not made for posterity to write history. These departments functioned as what would someone say as a sarkari daftar, that is government offices where records were kept, and these records were So those records were not meant to be, they were not produced for writing history for posterity. But what you can really derive from it becomes important. So, for instance, in a question like how do you think about something like textbook controversy, you cannot really collect much data, document, and evidences by doing field study because there is nothing in the field. The documents are with the government and they are in the archives. So it depends on the questions you're asking, and then you constitute your own archive. As Foucault would say, that your question would constitute your archive. Someone interested in social movements has to be in the fields. They might not find much in the revenue record and the home record at National Archive of India or a state archive in Bhubaneswar. But someone dealing with a peculiarly different question of textual traditions, of something like textbook controversy, has to depend on those records because there are then no evidences to write that history. You have to depend on those memos, on those press clippings, on that contemporary resources to trace that history out. The suggestion part is what? I mean, one of the major criticisms which the set of textbooks which the generation of Bipan Chandra, Romila Thapar, Irfan Habib, and others wrote was this great emphasis on something called scientific history. Indian History Congress is still today, as this largest organization of professional historians, lays emphasis on something called scientific history. Year after year, in their proceedings, they will come up with this call to write scientific history. What they do not realize or they ignore, they choose to ignore deliberately, is that by 1980s, the agenda of scientific history has came into a conflict with identity history in this country, with the politics of rising Bahujan movement and with the politics of rising religious movements. The question of identity has somehow taken a larger role than a scientific history. So today you might go and try to find out what an Ambedkar was doing in the freedom movement. But the criticism is right when the Dalit scholars argue that your history textbooks do not have enough of Ambedkar. Ambedkar only appears in the Pune Pact, nowhere else. No one knows what a Ambedkar or what a EVS Naikar Periyar. Whenever they'll go into the language controversy, the language controversy usually gets limited to Hindi Urdu controversy in North India. But you completely avoid a issue like the whole state of Odisha coming into existence on the basis of language and culture. That's the first example anywhere in world history when a whole modern province was carved out based on language identity with the consultation and cooperation of the colonial state. So there are a lot of divergent issues. There will be issues like the people from voices from southern state will keep on complaining that South India has not been given enough representation in these textbooks which are produced from Delhi. Northeast is completely absent. Even today, the agenda of adding Northeast to textbooks produced from Delhi, the nationalized textbook, is still going on. How do you really characterize the different issues of Muslims, of marginalized communities, of Dalits? Now, today, when this government in particular is attacking an agenda with the same, very aggressively by completely trying to, make these textbooks very pro-Hindu or trying to saffronize the whole curriculum, the voices on the other side are complaining about it, but they are not doing any kind of serious introspection about the kind of histories they have written. Now, the problem which we find ourselves today in is not something which is, a great matter of change. It is actually a matter of continuity. that the kind of imagination of nation which we had somehow has scattered the other side to attack on it. So if you have represented, I mean, this forum is called the Adivasi Center for Research and Development. If you think about the representation of Adivasis in NCERT textbooks, it's almost nil. I mean, the textbooks on modern history have written almost nothing about a great tradition of Adivasi rebellion against the colonial estate. Why? Because in modern historiography, that would be championed by someone called Ronajit Guha and subaltern studies. But that kind of politics has a different kind of ramifications when in the people who are writing textbooks for the government. Now, these are a different set of issues. The only thing which goes ahead is that how do you really train people in historical thinking? If today, I know you also do a lot of work on digital media, and you are also a media person among so many things you do. I mean, this whole idea of how fake news circulates. Now, if what we today famously called WhatsApp University, if your WhatsApp universities are making you read history, it is a failing, a complete failure of 40, 50 years of modern education system in this country, that we have not trained our people who, despite attending say 14, 15 years of a school education, cannot differentiate the fact from fiction, the fact from fabrication, the fact from falsification. Why is that so? So in this light, these debates have to be revisited, because we are losing a lot. In a country like ours, which claims to have a 5,000, 6,000 years of continuous history, a lot is on stake on historical representation. Everyone, the only field which needs a lot of democratization is history. Everyone needs a space in history. So history always becomes this battlefield. And that's why I very earlier I said that by 1960s, 70s, this was a non-issue, that whether Maharana Pratap is great or Akbar was great. But today it is an issue. And both the sides are not willing for any compromise. So this is something which has to be taken care of, that how do you really inculcate a sense of historical thinking in students, so that they are, ably equipped to differentiate the fact from the fiction, the fact from the distorted facts. Yeah.
Sanji, there are two questions in chat box, please. Yeah.
Sorry. So, in this current regime of India, there is a systematic attempt to legitimize the popular distortion of history, not only through textbooks, but also through social media, television, and glossy magazines. Even historians like Irfan Habib in Defense of History warned that the false history of nation will lead to false memory of an individual. As a student of history, what would be our responsibility to stop the distortion from ideological penetration? See, this is again a very one-sided view of the affairs. And Irfan Habib, being the leader of Indian History Congress and one of the foremost scholars of medieval India, and the range of issues he has written, of course, he has written from medieval, ancient to modern and contemporary. But this is again a very political stand. This really doesn't, kind of addresses the question I'm trying to raise, or anyone who is concerned about the discipline of history tries to raise. Let me give you like one simple example which can put all this thing in perspective. In 2005, something called award wapsi started happening in this country on the political issue that someone was killed in Aligarh, Muhammad Akhlaq, on the issue of beef debate. Right now, the representation is such that we will try to portray that beef debate is a very new debate in this country. The killing, the extrajudicial killing by the mob, which we call lynching, is deeply unfortunate. It should not happen in a country, in a democracy. But what it hides to you from you is that the issue of beef and cow slaughter is with us in this country for the past 250 years. We can find farmans of Aurangzeb, we can find farmans of Bahadur Shah Zafar. In revolt of 1857, Bahadur Shah Zafar famously wrote a farman asking Muslims to give up eating beef so that a united front of Hindus and Muslims could take a fight with the British soldiers. The first modern communal riot in this country happened in Azamgarh in 1892 on the issue of beef. Shahabad riots, 1917, the first major riot before partition, where which saw a killing of 5,000 people, was on the issue of beef. Now, these are the issues which we are struggling for the last 100 years. Every Gandhian mass movement, be it non-cooperation, be it civil disobedience movement, be it Quit India movement, also saw simultaneously succession of communal riots in this country across every major city: Kanpur, Allahabad, Nagpur, Bombay, Calcutta, Chennai, Hyderabad. Most of them encountered communal riots. What these historians have done is they chose not to write about it. I, in my research, have called it noble lies. Noble lies is something which Plato has used, where your intentions are very noble. You think that by teaching students secular histories, you can make them secular citizens. You don't teach them about Hindu-Muslim enmity, and you will have a Hindu-Muslim brotherhood. But the whole point is that what Habib is suggesting is exactly this, that people just do not depend on history for their actions. They depend on history for their actions. They depend on history for their actions. They depend on history for their actions. But still, how many of them were reading history textbooks? But still, we saw partition, we saw mad riots. The cultural issues never go away. Until and unless you will address those issues, it will not go away. The present regime has taken a very different course of action, which is either not helping the case. But then, as a student of history, I'm not really interested in what is happening now. I'm interested in what has happened 30 years before, because I have to depend on my historical modalities. I am interested in the problem that what has happened wrongly in the past, which has led to a present like this. That why the question of Maharana Pratap is also great, Akbar is also great, both are Indians, both were famous Indian rulers on which we can be proud. From that discourse, why we have reached to this discourse where either one of them can be great, the other cannot. Something has gone dramatically wrong between these years. We need to think about that. I think the problems of today are the consequences of what has been done wrong in the past. That wrong was only this one thing, according to my view. They thought, let's hide certain facts, let's brush aside certain, uncomfortable facts. And by reading that secular history, we will have secular citizens. That plan has gone wrong. You cannot write about temple discretions. Everyone agrees that temples were destroyed. The numbers are contested. How many temples were destroyed? From the right wing side, Sitaram Goel will argue that so number thousands of temples were destroyed. But from the scholarly side, David Eaton would argue that temples were destroyed. The numbers are heavily reported, but people agree that temples were destroyed. If you don't write their history, you think people will forget this fact that temples were destroyed. Thousands and thousands of pilgrims every year would go to a Kashi, would go to a Mathura, would go to a, different places, and they can see it's right there. So how what to do about it? You have to question it, right? And then the other question is when CBSE drops important chapters as school textbooks in the name of rationalizing syllabus, is there anywhere to stop? See, it's again the government tactics. They say that they are reducing the syllabus because of the corona, but we know that those chapters have to come. That's not an important issue. The important issue is that after national education policy, now they have already made new draft curriculum in place. And in the coming 1 to 2 years, these this current set of textbooks, which were authored by my teacher and mentor Niladri Bhattacharya and Hari Vasudevan, would be away. So start thinking about the new challenges. I mean, these challenge currently 2 days 3 days back, the head of the national education policy task team in Karnataka argued that Pythagoras theorem was not formulated by Pythagoras. Very well. He argues that it has its roots in Veda. Very well. What is the evidence? On the evidence part, it says that these are the discussions on Quora and Google. These are the kind of things we are literally arguing with. We are not against this indigenous agenda. We want to celebrate our indigenous knowledge. We want to see that if there is really something called Vedic mathematics, which derives from Rig Veda, but you need to have more concrete, scholarly, substantial evidence about it. You cannot just say it because there are people who say it on internet, right? So these are contentious issues. I mean, Irfan Habib makes a prescription of it. We know that so much of discussion is going on social media and in glossy magazines. We know that there are so many people who don't listen to Irfan Habib, who abuse him. We know that 25 of the greatest historians in this country sitting in JNU wrote a report in 1990 that there was nothing called Ram Mandir. But today we are seeing a Ram Mandir being built. The question which Dipesh Chakrabarti really raises has not been answered by either of these stalwarts, whether Habib or Thapar or anyone, that why people are not willing to listen to you, the secular historians. Why people are happy reading a Vikram Sampath or some Sanyal, Sanjeev Sanyal, and or a Purushottam Nagesh Oak. Why people are ready to believe a Oak rather than a specialist Mughal historian who might have dedicated his lifetime of work studying Mughal architecture and Taj Mahal. That is an answer. That is the question we should be raising, and that is an answer we should be asking. That why these most stalwart historians became so delegitimized, why their speciality, their expertise is not taken into account.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Shaan. You rightly picked out the Ranjit Guha and subaltern study, how the politics playing a big role behind history writing. When somebody is going to writing history, particularly in a contemporary days and in contest or in periodical of Odisha since 2000, when the Navin regime came in past, like 22 years of regime. How do you differentiate and how do you comparison the dialogue between in a oral narration, particularly the 21st century's world, life world, when everything you rightly pointed out the WhatsApp university, how do you know and how do you quickly react on fact and fluctuate fact? How do you know what is fact and how do you know what is fluctuate facts? With this contest, when always history narrations in terms of contest and recontest and rise and rose and revolt, these kind of words always you rightly you talked in your conversation. If somebody doing research on social movement, he did not require to go to the archive or even not attend any kind of this particular primary source, what you call a newspaper or etc. But when you start thinking and realizing and start interpreting these sources you mentioned earlier in modern history, there is nothing to represent about these tribal sources. the tribal histories, the tribal language, the tribal culture. And you rightly mentioned about only state in the earth or planet, which has been stated only language and culture orientation and stand alone with a state in 1936 as a separate linguistic state. And then how to realize and interpret these sources in a scientific temper in Indian History Congress, the only and single scientific research team after Indian Science Congress, the professionals, the professional bodies, the professional member, and the professional historians. How could you relate the story into the textbook? And in particular, how the text narration into the narration of textbook orientation in classrooms, in debates. Many debates we listen and we hesitate about how the real fact missing out, because these facts always depend on fluctuate facts. What is your assumptions and what is your suggestions for the young historian in particular? Those are very keen interest to write contemporary history.
Well, to give a suggestion would be asking a lot. I myself is a young student of history. So all I can say is, share some of the assumptions with which I work. The idea is that history. Now, what they mean by scientific history is very dubiously defined. Indian History Congress, from the very beginning, and I can say that with some assurance because I have spent some 6, 7 years with proceedings of Indian History Congress since 1935. So I have read volumes and volumes of these proceedings. Indian History Congress, from its very inception, has taken great political stands. And they have always allowed politicians to, certain politicians, to share their stage and to dictate them that what kind of history should be written. So if you go to the earlier days, you can find out a Rajendra Prasad telling historians what national history should look like, and Nehru and others, session after session, telling them that what history should look like. Now, Indian History Congress, from its origin, is guilty of welcoming politicians into the business of history writing. As a foremost organization of professional historians in this country, they allowed the politicization of history deliberately. Otherwise, why else a non trained historian who is a politician who has no business of history writing should come and dictate you year after year that how history should be written? This is a practice which continues till date. So you will have a governor or a president, not president or prime ministers now, because of course there's a BJP government in Delhi. But when you go back 5, 6 years back in the Congress times, and you will find a Pranav Mukherjee or a Manmohan Singh attending these conferences and telling you that how history should be written. So Indian History Congress is not at all a neutral body. These historians are also citizens. These historians have backed certain kind of politics. These historians attack certain kind of politics. And that's why when today the politicians are attacking has taken various very clear political standpoints. It talks about historical distortion only when a certain government changes in power in Delhi. Now, Indian History Congress also has its political persuasions. So you can think about something like subaltern studies, which came as a very radical intervention and challenged the whole process of nation making in this country, because it argued that, you know, stakeholders like Adivasis and tribals are not represented fairly in the process of nation making, do not have big takers in Indian History Congress. I can tell you with a lot of conformity from my reading that you might not find a lot of papers of subaltern studies persuasion being published in the proceedings of Indian History Congress or being awarded the best paper prize. We are stuck in a situation where the people who are in power heavily distrust the professional historical establishment in this country. The other crisis is that the other side do not have professional historians. They might have a Bikram Sampath, they might have a Sanjeev Sanyal, they might have a certain archaeologist like some Chakravarti, Dilip Chakravarti, but they do not have enough professional expertise to write histories which conform to certain historical standards which conform to certain historical continuity. I mean, come on, you don't have to see very far. You just have to see your neighbor China. It is also a peculiar example of a history where there's a long continuity of civilization. So this whole, this crisis is very serious because of this particular predicament. The political establishment heavily distrusts the establishment of history writing professionals. The history writing professionals heavily detest the political establishment, that is the BJP and the RSS, and the professionals which the done a 5,000 word here is this very complicated figure called Vinayak Damodar Savarkar. His life could be studied in these very two distinct phases. That he started as one of the brightest revolutionaries this country has ever seen. He dedicated a lifetime of work for liberation. His methods were not endorsed by the mainstream politics. But then we also see a very different Savarkar when he comes out of the Andamans. A Savarkar who largely remains confined to Ratnagiri. A Savarkar who has, you know, done basically nothing in the big contribution ways for the freedom struggle movement. Savarkar was not a party who was dealing with the British. Savarkar was not a party who led any reform movements on the scale of, let's say, an Ambedkar or a Periyar. Savarkar was very much confined to a political trajectory which became marginalized. Today, that political trajectory has become most powerful, and that's why Savarkar is being celebrated as the new father of the nation. The problem is this, that the political power which is in Delhi wants to project this figure as the only figure who was doing everything. The other side, the professionals, the History Congress, they do not want to concede any space to Savarkar. For them, Savarkar's story is only limited to clemency petitions in Andaman. माफीनामा लिखा था और कुछ नहीं किया था. भाई इतनी complicated जिंदगी है that cannot be just reduced to 6 clemency petitions. It is much more than that. So what do you need is this middle path where you evaluate someone on the deeds which they did. Clemency petition is also a part of it, but revolutionary politics is also a part of it. Hindutva ideology is also a part of it. He was a brilliant theoretician. That's also a part of it. He became one of the parties to the assassination of Gandhi. That's also a part of it. And then he was also exonerated by the court because there was no evidence. That's also a part of it. Sampath has written about it. So why do you still want to keep making someone a part of Gandhi's assassination plan when there were no evidences and when no new evidences are coming which directly implicate him? So what do you need is this middle path, this balance of approach where you judge someone by what he did. Aurangzeb was this fantastic ruler when it comes to Jagirdari, when it comes to the, the wrath of the Mughal Empire, the rise of the Mughal Empire. But Aurangzeb also had very typical fundamentalist policies where many times religion was the motivation. So why you cannot analyze Aurangzeb on both the scales? Why Aurangzeb is only a fanatic, or as the Audrey Trushke would argue that Aurangzeb is this only liberal ruler who has no religious persuasions. That's just untrue. The evidences are not about it. There is a Farman in Banaras Hindu University Museum. I have seen that Farman. It's a Farman where there he allocated certain properties to certain families and he said that why do you deliberately want to hide one fact and highlight and accentuate the other fact? This double play has landed us here. That today, no one wants any bridges, no one wants any conversation, no one wants any balance. It's either this way or that way. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Mr. San. I will end to say one of very fantastic example from the cinema called Manikarnika. The lead role played by Kangana Ranaut. One villain came and he shouted, "इतिहास वही लिखेगा जो जिंदा रहेगा." What is your assumptions on particular this statement and this kind of arrogance?
This is not arrogance, this is reality. History has always been a bad partner with politics. The people who will control politics, they will write history, and their history sustains because at the end of the day, a history congress or a few professors sitting in JNU cannot really fight with the state power. They have done it in the past. It has suit their agenda. I mean, has anyone ever thought that why Bipin Chandra and his colleagues who wrote India's Struggle for Independence, published by Penguin in 1989. It has sold more than 1 million copies. Why this book has become so important that it is read by college students, it is read by people who prepare for UPSC and everything. There is an interesting take about it. If you open the book, of sanctions. Any knowledge becomes important, any knowledge becomes official knowledge when it is backed by the power of the state. Why one kind of argument gathers more acceptability than the other argument? Why Bipin Chandra is a much more popular name, much more well-known name in India than Ranajit Guha? Because Bipin Chandra's history writing became official knowledge. It actually got some kind of patronage by this Indian state, which Ranajit Guha didn't. Today, the same kind of patronage is provided to a Vikram Sampath. Today, the same kind of patronage is provided to a Sanjeev Sanyal or a David Frawley. These are the people who will go and write our next set of textbooks. These are the people who are involved in the drafting committees and curriculums. And tomorrow, when their textbooks will come up, That will become the official knowledge. A teacher teaching in some remote school in Koraput and Kalahandi, who is either going for a textbook by Odisha government curriculum or an NCERT national curriculum, it doesn't have to do much with these debates. उनको जो बोला जाएगा वो पढ़ाएंगे. So the official knowledge will always have a state patronage. Today the official knowledge is somewhere else because the party in Delhi is something else. So that's right. जो जिंदा रहेगा वही history लिखेगा. So that's a very realist Machiavellian take on history writing. That the people who are in power, they will write a history which everyone will read.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Shaan, for very wonderful deliberation. With this note, now I would like to invite Rudunarayan Das to go for a formal vote of thanks. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. J. And thank you, Mr. Shaan, for a very outstanding and wonderful conversation. And your deliberation is quite impressive, and you are sharing your ideas on different aspects of history writing, and definitely the session will be very helpful, and you have wonderfully explained several aspects of history writing, as well as uh, why these kind of controversies arise in particularly in our textbook oriented issues. Thank you so much for joining us to this session. Now I'd like to thank all for the institutional support, Ravenshaw University, Central University of Odisha, and Indian Institute of Management for their relentless support to Center for Adivasi Research and Development for organizing this kind of intellectual gathering. I would like to thank all our patrons, Professor Sanjay Naik, Professor Sarat Kumar Palita, and Professor Mahadev Joyswal, and our conveners, Professor Chandi Prasad Nanda and Charudat Panigrahi. And I would like to thank the Director, Center for Adivasi Research and Development, Dr. Jena, who continuously encourages us to think, discuss, and dialogue over important social, political, economic, and burning issues of the state. Thank you so much, and thank you all our participants who are joining us here, and maximum listeners in Facebook and YouTube. Thank you all for such for part of this symposium today. Thank you all. The meeting is concluded.